Okay, welcome to part 2 of chapter 3, Satisfaction Guaranteed. Let's keep going. Again, as I've mentioned, one of the core contexts of most sort of economic thought resides in what we call the utility function. The utility function is really just a mathematical representation of an individual's happiness or an individual's satisfaction. What we do in economics is we imagine that your utility function is a function of the various goods, services, amenities, experiences that you go through, and that you derive happiness or satisfaction, however you want to think about it. You derive satisfaction from your experiences, whether those be consumptive experiences in the context of you eating, a wonderful meal, or whether you happen to visit a national park, for example, and you take in the beautiful vistas, right? Economists would tend to frame both of those as quote unquote consumption, which I think sometimes puts us outside of how most people tend to think about these issues. So when you hear me say consumption and you hear me talk about goods, really that concept of goods can mean everything from a cheeseburger to a beach, to clean air, to a river. And in many respects, we can consume those goods, services, and amenities in a variety of different ways. You can consume a river by swimming in it. You can consume a river by fishing out of it. You can consume a river by shipping goods along it. There are a lot of different ways in which society can consume things like rivers or waterways or generally nature that we wouldn't often think about in terms of consumption. Now, if we take a forest and we chop it down and we use it for lumber, I think that we can see that as sort of consumption. It's sort of, right there in our way. In this particular utility function, we simply say that your satisfaction is a function of goods X and Y. You can, again, define X and Y to be whatever you want. Now, the simplifying assumption here is that we're only generally going to consume utility functions that have two factors, two goods, X and Y. We could, of course, jam as many other goods and services and amenities into utility function, perhaps to reflect the truly complex nature of consumption. But every time we add a variable beyond the second, we'd also have to add a dimension to our mathematical process, and the math really blows up. So if we keep it at two goods, then it becomes much more easy for us to understand, and we don't really lose anything by keeping it at two goods. One sneaky trick that economists have is we might say something like, X is tacos and Y is every other thing you consume but tacos. Right? That's a sneaky way to get everything into that utility function when, really we're just obviously making a pretty big shortcut. Want to bring back this concept of diminishing marginal returns, highly correlated with the idea of the utility function. The first slice of pizza is generally going to taste better than the fifth slice, even though they came from the same pizza. The reason being that utility functions tend to show diminishing marginal returns. This is both true in a physical context. You can't eat an infinite number of slices of pizza. It's also true in a more figurative context, in that eventually psychologically we tend to get tired of consuming a lot of units of the same thing. You should recall that one of the assertions we made in chapter 1 was that optimal decisions are made on the margin. And when we say that optimal decisions are made on the margin, what we're essentially saying is that by thinking on the margin, we can avoid the problem of diminishing marginal returns. So if you've ever been in a situation where you had the option to order a certain number of a product, a food product, for example, and you ordered a lot more than you ultimately needed, and maybe you ended up having to throw away some of the product that you purchased, you know precisely what we're talking about here. So again, instead of thinking about the consumption of goods as being, about, consuming as much as possible, we're really going to think about consumption as being this incremental process where I will choose to consume as long as I find that consumption worthwhile. And essentially what we will later on point out is that the idea of finding consumption worthwhile is both going to be a factor of your utility function as well as your budget. Because of course, your ability to consume goods and services and amenities is very much determined by what your income is, what we will call your budget constraint. Here's just an illustration of diminishing marginal returns in the context of consuming tacos. What you should see is that as we consume more tacos, our utility tends to rise until we consume that fifth taco and we see our utility actually go down. But more importantly, what you should look at is marginal utility. And you should notice that every taco has lower marginal utility than the one before it, which just means that as we consume that additional taco, we did not experience as much happiness. So the amount of happiness we're seeing from consumption of tacos is in fact declining. The idea of consumer preferences is that we want to define very general ways in which consumers will behave. That is to say that in order to make the theoretical foundation of utility functions useful to us, we have to create some rules to not necessarily make the theory work, right? Because that would be highly problematic. But rather, we want to set some ground rules that inject rationality into the analysis. We want our utility functions to make sense. We want them to be intuitive. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the course, this is a big, fact about economic models is that economists want them to be intuitive. They should make sense to us. They should work in a way that, as much as possible, mimics the way in which people actually tend to behave. And here are some of those ground rules that we'll set for utility functions. So utility functions are going to produce preferences that follow these three assumptions. Preference assumption one is that more is better. We're going to generally assume that you would prefer more of a good than less of a good. Now, of course, still keeping in mind the context of diminishing marginal returns, but the way that you can think about this is that if someone offers you $10 or $5, you will take $10. Right? Because you can do more with $10 than you can do with $5. So just for simplicity's sake, more is better. Bundle preferences are transitive. When we say bundles, what we mean is that you're going to consume X and Y together as a bundle. So you're going to go to the store, you're going to buy a certain amount of X, you're going to buy a certain amount of Y, right? And that's the bundle of X and Y that you have consumed. What we're going to say is that bundle preferences are transient. So what this means is that let's say we have a bundle A. A has a certain amount of X and Y. We have bundle B and C. Both, again, have certain amounts of X and Y. If I prefer bundle A to B, and I prefer bundle B to C, then the transitivity property just means that I would also prefer A to C, right? That's what we mean by transitivity. So if I prefer A to B, and I prefer B to C, then we're going to assume that I would also prefer A to C. Again, this may seem like kind of a weird assumption to make, but I can assure you it's very crucial to our understanding of what we will later call revealed preference. That is to say, we can actually uncover individual preferences by simply looking at how people behave. And this assumption is very important. The last assumption is that consumers prefer averages to extremes. So let's say you consume X and Y, and you have a bundle which has a lot of X and almost none of Y, or you have a bundle which has a medium amount of X and a medium amount of Y. What we're going to say is that you tend to prefer the bundle that has a medium amount of both, right? That we tend to not prefer extremes. Obviously, this is also wrapped up in the notion of diminishing marginal returns. And so if I have a lot of X and almost no Y, I'm going to generally wish that I had more Y and a little bit less X. By the way, this also is an incentive for people to engage in transactions. So let's say that I happen to have a lot of good X and I don't have very much good Y, but I want more of good Y. Well, then I can go find someone who maybe they have a lot of good Y and not very much good X, and we can engage in a trade. We can engage in a transaction and perhaps lead to a Pareto optimal solution. So this is going to be, in a sense, the kind of nature of transactions. Why do people engage in transactions? Because of mutual benefits. You have something I want, I have something you want. If we engage in transaction, we can make each other better off, right? Transactions have the potential to make each other better off. And to take this idea of the utility function and add a little bit of mathematical complexity, but also to give us, again, a framework that we can understand and talk about, and also manipulate to various scenarios. We want to talk about various scenarios, and that way we can sort of understand how economics, fits into that conversation. So what we have in economics is what we call the indifference curve. What the indifference curve does is it represents a level of utility, okay? So in the figure to the left here, you can see that we have 3 bundles of goods. This bundle has 10 units of X and 50 units of Y. This bundle has 60 units of both. And this bundle, we can see, has 50 units of X and 10 units of Y. And what we want to do is we want to think about the bundles as if they're lying along different utility levels. So we think about bundles, and we think about the idea that different bundles yield different levels of potential utility, okay? And the way that we're going to think about it is we're going to think about levels of utility as being illustrated by utility functions and indifference curves. And so if we look at this indifference curve here, indifference curve 1, we can see that both of these bundles lie on the same indifference curve. This means that this bundle and this bundle yield for me the exact same level of utility. I'm no happier with this bundle than I am with this bundle. I am completely indifferent between those 2 bundles. Now, if we look at this bundle, we can see that this bundle is on a higher indifference curve, which means it gives us more utility, okay? If you'll recall, one of the assumptions of preferences we made was that people tend to prefer averages to extremes. You should see that this bundle here is a little bit more of averages of the 2 goods, where these bundles have a little bit more of extreme. This one has an extreme amount of X, this one has an extreme amount of Y. So it's no surprise then that a bundle that has a non-extreme amount of X and a non-extreme amount of Y would in fact be on a higher level of utility, okay? And further, what we're going to say is that the goal of consumption is to maximize your utility. That is to consume on the highest possible indifference curve that we are able to consume. So imagine you go into a grocery store and you're buying units of X and Y. If you can afford this bundle here on the 3rd indifference curve, this is the bundle that you would consume relative to these 2 other bundles. If you can afford this bundle, you will not buy either of these 2 bundles because that would maximize your utility. This bundle here would, in fact, maximize your utility. Now, it could also be the case that you can't afford this bundle. So this bundle would make you most happy, but maybe you don't have the income to afford this particular bundle, and you have to buy bundles that are cheaper, right? That's obviously a very real possibility that we certainly want to explore in the context of economic questions. So students oftentimes find indifference curves to be fairly difficult to understand, but the basic idea is they represent levels of utility. And so when we say levels of utility, what we mean is that each indifference curve yields a particular amount of utility, and every bundle on that indifference curve yields the same level of utility. And our goal as a consumer is to maximize our utility, meaning we want to consume the highest possible indifference curve that we can. And again, we're going to do so by thinking on the margin. We're going to optimize our happiness by thinking on the margin. This idea of income, this idea of constrained optimization, because that's what utility maximization is, it's constrained optimization. So we're trying to maximize our utility, but we're do so subject to our budget constraint. And our budget constraint is made up of 2 factors. It's made up of how much money we have, our income, and the prices of the 2 goods in question. Here, good Y and good X. And the basic rule is that you cannot consume an amount of X and Y that would cost you more than your income, right? This is the constraint of your income. You cannot consume beyond your income. And so utility maximization becomes a puzzle of maximize my utility subject to my budget constraint. Now the budget constraint itself, here we see illustrated in the graph, creates what we call the choice set. Okay, the gray area on this graph represents the choice set. What this is it represents every affordable bundle. And so the line itself, which is the budget constraint, represents, you can afford anything on the bundle, you can afford anything on the line, and you can afford anything inside of the line. Okay, this represents your choice set. Now, we're going to make a general rule that says that we tend to consume on the budget constraint itself. That is that we tend to exhaust all of our income. In fact, we'll make this an assumption later on in the context of utility maximization is we will assume that people spend all of their money. So in these very straightforward economic models that we're going to talk about, we're going to assume that there's no savings or anything. That you go into a store, you have a particular budget in mind, you will exhaust your resources in an effort to maximize your utility. This is, of course, a simplistic view of transactions. People have a lot of different reasons for spending money and saving money, but in our simple economic models, at least at this point, we're going to assume that we always consume on the budget constraint itself. And then a non-trivially important point is that the slope of the budget constraint, in fact, is just a ratio of the prices of the goods. And also that the slope of the budget constraint represents the opportunity cost of switching consumption between the two goods. So if I am consuming a particular amount of good X and I want to consume less X and more Y, the prices of X and Y will dictate my ability to do so. Right? They will dictate the opportunity cost of changing my consumption from X to Y. That opportunity cost is simply the ratio of the prices between the two goods. And then lastly, in the context of budgets, they can change. They can change for two reasons. What we call price effects. So we see here on the left, this is a circumstance where the price of good X has increased. This causes what we call a pivot of our budget constraint to the left. And what you should now see is that because I consume X and Y and X has become more expensive, I can no longer consume the same bundles that I could before, which makes a lot of sense. So if this is my budget constraint before, price of X went up, this is my budget constraint afterwards. You can see that my choice set is now smaller. Again, this should make a lot of sense. And my ability to consume has now been restricted. So this is what happens. If you consume goods and the prices of one of the goods that you consume rises, this now constricts your ability to consume all the other goods that you consume, assuming you still consume that good. Now, you could substitute away. You could no longer consume the good whose price increased, which is certainly sometimes what occurs, in order to sort of retain your choice set from before, but sometimes it's unavoidable. Say if the price increase is your electricity rates, or the price increase is on a necessary good like milk, where you have to buy milk basically every week. So if the price of milk rises, not only does this reduce your ability to buy milk, it also will reduce your ability to buy other goods, given that you're almost certainly going to buy milk each week still, even though the price has increased. And then in the right here, we can see what happens when your income rises. So when your income rises, this causes what we call a shift of your budget constraint. So a pivot is caused by price changes, and a shift is caused by income changes. And we can see naturally that as you make more income, your choice set grows. You're now able to consume more goods than you were able to before. And so also this means that you're likely to be able to consume on a higher indifference curve, right? Whereas we can see here in the left panel, if a price of good X were to go up, I probably have to consume on a lower indifference curve now. So when prices go up, my utility tends to fall. When my income rises, my utility tends to increase. Those are probably not surprising statements, but I think it's informative to see these graphically. Right. One of the things that I always loved about economics was that, okay, yeah, certainly sometimes the analysis seems a bit straightforward, right? The prices of the goods you consume go up, your happiness may be lower, or if your income goes up, your happiness may be more. But I think it's very important and instructive for us to be able to show this in a very simplistic way as we have in these two graphs and figures. And I say simplistic not because I think that these are necessarily easy to understand when you first see them, but once you get the hang of budget constraints and what they represent, I think the story is fairly straightforward. Okay, that's going to wrap up video 2. I look forward to seeing you next.